A rural county bus garage, April 1977. 6 in the morning, the lights still gray. A transportation supervisor stands beside a new bus delivered on a flatbed the week before, running a hand along a fuel tank now bolted behind a steel guard that does not exist on the older bus parked next to it. Nothing about the route this bus will drive in 90 minutes has changed. Everything about what sits under the floor has. This scene, or one close to it, happened in transportation garages in every state that sprang. Not because a single dramatic accident had forced it, but because the federal government had spent the better part of a decade building a new set of construction rules for school buses, and April 1st, 1977, was the date those rules took effect. 3 of them applied to nothing else on the road but school buses: a rollover protection standard for the body structure, a body jaunt strength standard for the panel seams, and a seating standard built around a concept called compartmentalization. A 4th rule, already governing passenger cars and light trucks, was extended on the same date to cover large school buses specifically. The fuel system had to survive a barrier crash without spilling. The school bus, as a national object, had not changed its construction rules in any comprehensive way since 1939, since a professor named Frank Sear had brought representatives of 48 states to a room at Columbia's Teachers College for 7 days and produced 44 standards, among them the shade of yellow every bus in the country still wears. Those 1939 standards were about making a chaotic ad hoc system of trucks, wagons, and mismatched vehicles into something a manufacturer could build on an assembly LN and a parent could recognize on a road. They said almost nothing about what happened to a bus body or the fuel tank underneath it in a crash. For 38 years, that gap simply existed. It existed through the war years, through the post-war suburban boom, through the consolidation movement that put more children on longer rural routes than ever before. It existed while the vehicle count rose into the tens of millions of daily rides. And on this specific morning in 1977, a transportation supervisor standing in a rural garage was looking at the first bus his district had ever purchased, where the answer to what happens to the fuel tank in a wreck was not a matter of luck or bodybuilder reputation, but a federal number the manufacturer was legally required to meet. What specifically had the federal government spent those years deciding needed to change? And why had it taken 38 years, from a room at Columbia in 1939 to a garage floor in 1977, for anyone to change it? Back at the garage, the Transportatown supervisor's job that morning was not abstract. He had to know specfically what he was now required to accept from a manufacturer and what he could no longer accept. FMVSS 220 addressed the body's roof and structure directly. A rollover protection standard because in a bus that rolls, the thing that kills or spares a child's, whether the roof and side structure hold their shape or collapse inward. FMVSS 221 addressed something less visible but just as structural: the strength of the joints between body panels, because a body that is strong in the middle and weak at the seams fails exactly where the seams are. FMVSS 222 rebuilt the entire passenger compartment around a concept called compartmentalization: closely spaced, high-backed, padded seats designed so that in a crash, a child's body is contained and cushioned by the seat structure in front of them, the way an egg is protected by the compartments of its carton, without requiring the child to buckle anything. And FMVSS 301, already governing cars, was extended to large school buses specifically. The fuel system now had to survive a crash test at 30 miles per hour. The fuel system now had to survive a specified barrier impact, front, rear, and side, without leaking more than a defined amount of fuel per minute afterward. None of these four numbers changed where a bus went. None of them changed a route, a schedule, a stop sequence, or a driver's daily responsibilities. What they changed was what had to be true about the vehicle before a district was legally permitted to put it on the road at all. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American school bus culture from 1930 to 1980. What the bus was, how the route worked, and what the people inside the system knew that no record ever quite captured. Not nostalgia for yellow buses, the documented operational and human reality of a system that carried an entire generation to school. Nobody riding a school bus today thinks about the reinforced roof over their head or the shielded tank under their seat. Both exist because of a regulatory date almost no one who benefits from it has ever heard of. And if you rode a school bus in this era or worked in pupil-transported ion, put it in the comments. If you rode a bus built before or after April 1977, do you remember anyone ever explaining why the newer buses looked or rode differently? Or did nobody explain it at all? A future video follows one specific rural district's decade-long fight to retire its last pre-1977 bus under exactly this kind of budget pressure. Back at the garage, the four numbers told the supervisor what the vehicle now had to be. They told him nothing about what driving and maintaining it would actually require of the people responsible for it, week after week, for the next decade. That was a different kind of knowledge, and it had to be built the same way route knowledge always had. By doing the job, the four standards did not require a transportation director to become an engineer, but they required something almost as demanding, a new kind of literacy, learned the same way route knowledge had always been learned. Through use, through mistakes, through the slow accumulation of specific cases. Pre-trip inspection sheets, largely unchanged since the 1950s in most districts, now had to account for structural elements a mechanic could not simply eyeball the way he could check a headlight or a tire tread. A body joint failing to meet FMVSS 221 in the field was not something a driver could detect by walking around the bus in the dark at 5:45 in the morning. Compliance, once the vehicle left the factory, lived mostly in the paperwork, the compliance plate near the driver's door, the manufacturer's certification, and in the driver's trust that the paperwork was accurate. That trust had not been required in the same way before 1977, because before 1977 there had been no specific federal number a driver could check the paperwork against. Procurement changed in a way that mattered more to a district's budget than to its drivers. A compliant bus cost more to build than a pre-1977 bus. And that cost showed up on every purchase order a rural school board approved from 1977 forward. In wealthier suburban districts, replacing an aging fleet on a normal schedule absorbed the cost without much visible strain. In poorer rural districts, the same districts that had always run the longest routes on the worst roads, the choice was blunter. Replace fewer buses each year, or replace them on schedule and cut something else. Neither choice was recorded anywhere as a safety Dexon. Both choices were, functionally, exactly that. What did not change at all was the driver's actual job behind the wheel. The route was the same route. The stop sequence was the same sequence, the specific curve, the specific hill, the specific family that needed an extra minute. None of that lived in a federal standard, and none of it was touched by one. A driver who had learned a route over a decade stall knew the only way that knowledge had ever been built, by driving, morning after morning, through every season to contained. So the vehicle changed and the driver's job did not, what if anything, changed for the child sitting behind the driver, in a seat now built to a standard that did not exist the year before. For the overwhelming majority of children, the honest answer is almost nothing changed that they could name. A child getting on a bus built to the new standards in the fall of 1977 sat in a seat with a taller, more padded seat back in front of them than the bus their older sibling had ridden 3 years earlier. They may have registered without being able to say why, that the seats felt closer together, or that the ride felt slightly heavier and more solid over the same rough county road. None of that registered as safety. It registered, if it registered at all, as simply what a new bus felt like, the way any new vehicle feels different from an old one, without the difference having a name. This is worth stating plainly, because it is the honest center of the story, rather than an inconvenient footnote to it. The 1977 standards were, for most children, invisible. Standards were, for most children, invisible. They'd not changed the bump at the county line that told a child how far they were from home. They'd not changed the specific engine sound on the hill past the grain elevator. They did not change the driver, the stop sequence, or the specific morning ritual of waiting at the end of a lane in the cold. A federal engineering Dexon, made in offices far from any spec-C route, left the actual daily experience of riding a school bus almost completely untouched. There was one meaningful exception, and it did not come from the 4 crash protection standards directly. It came from a parallel piece of federal legislation moving through Congress in the same years. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which required public schools, TUN Act, which required public schools to educate children with disabilities, and as a practical consequence, required someone to get those children to school. For a child who used a wheelchair, the difference was not a matter of a taller seatback. It was the difference between a bus that could carry them and one that could not. Districts began fitting buses with lifts. The safety engineering for those children lagged behind the engineering for everyone else. For years, the seating standards crash protecting language was written around forward-facing passengers, and did not fully address a child postponed sideways in a wheelchair. But the more basic fact that a bus could now physically get them there was itself the largest single change this era produced for any child in the system. What did parents, watching their children board these buses in the fall of 1977, actually believe had changed, and how much of that belief matched what had spectrally been engineered? Parents in the fall of 1977 did not read federal standard numbers. What most of them absorbed was a simpler, less precise idea, carried by local news coverage and school board announcements. The buses are safer now. That belief was accurate in substance and imprecise in almost every specific it implied. Compartmentalization, the concept behind FMVSS 222, is worth explaining plainly because it is routinely misunderstood, then and since. It was not a decision that seatbelts were unnecessary. It was a specific engineering judgment made after the agency's rulemaking considered belts and anchorages directly, that closely spaced, energy-absorbing, high-backed seats designed to contain and cushion a child's body against the seat ahead in a crash, without requiring a young child to correctly buckle anything, produced better real-world protection for the age group and seating pattern of a school bus than a seatbelt requirement would have. The rule did not forbid a state or district from installing belts anyway. It simply did not require them, and it built the entire passenger compartment around a different protective principle. A parent who assumed safer buses meant buses now have seat belts like our car was, in the specific mechanism, wrong and largely never told so, because the distinction rarely made it into local coverage of a national regulatory change. This is where the context layer of this story matters most. Before you can understand why 1977 mattered the way it did, you need to understand what a federal motor vehicle safety standard actually is and is not. It is not a law that individual drivers or districts violate and get punished for on a route-by-route basis. It is a manufacturing requirement, a condition a vehicle must meet before it can legally be sold as new. That is why the standards changed the buses coming off the assembly line in 1977, and changed nothing immediately about the buses already on the road. A rural district's existing fleet, bought in 1965, 1969, 1971, remained perfectly legal to operate for as long as the vehicles passed ordinary state inspection. The new construction standards and the old rolling fleet existed side by side for years in the same parking lots. That single fact, that the rule governed manufacture, not the existing fleet, is the seam along which the rest of this story runs. Because the standard governed only new manufacture, implementation was never a single national moment. It was a decade-long, uneven process, and its unevenness followed the same fault line that had always run through American school transportation: money. Suburban districts with growing tax bases could cycle their fleets on a regular schedule and absorb the higher cost of a compliant bus without much visible strain. Rural districts, the ones running the longest routes over the worst roads to serve the fewest children per mile, faced the same higher price tag with a smaller tax base to draw from. School district transportation records and state reports from TRKS Parod document what any transportation director NA budget. Constrained county already knew without needing a report to tell him. A bus bought in 1974 did not become unsafe on April 1st, 1977. It simply became a bus built to an older, less protective standard, still fully legal, still running its route, for as long as the district could not afford to replace it. In many rural countries, that meant pre-1977 buses stayed in active service well into the 1980s. This is not a footnote, and it is not a criticism of any specific district. It is the plain operational consequence of a rule that regulated manufacturing rather than mandating fleet replacement, applied to a country where school transportation funding varied enormously by tax base. The same driver who had spent 14 years learning a rural route might spend the back half of his career driving a bus built to the old standard, parked every night next to a newer district vehicle built to the new one, with no functional difference in his daily job and a real, documented difference in what would happen to that specific vehicle in a specific kind of crash. The clearest illustration of what that gap could mean did not arrive until 1988, well outside this era, in Carrollton, Kentucky, when a former school bus being used by a church group, a vehicle built before the 1977 standards took effect, was struck head-on and burned, a tragedy that federal investigators later traced in part to exactly the pre-1977 fuel system and exit design the 1977 rule had been written to correct. It is mentioned here not to sensationalize it, but because it is the plainest documented answer to a question the Sarah. Other was leaves open. What Specfcully had 38 years of an unregulated fuel tank and body structure actually been risking? What did the formal end of that 38-year gap mean for the system as a whole? Not for one bus, one district, or one child, but for what school transportation was now understood to be. Here the context layer matters again, and it is worth stating plainly rather than gesturing at. Ron Kinney of the National Association for Pupil Transportation has identified 1977 as the last comprehensive structural overhaul of school bus construction standards since Frank Sears' 1939 conference. A nearly 40-year gap closed in a single regulatory package covering rollover protection, body joint strength, seating and crash protection, and fuel system integrity. That is not a marketing description. It is the plain shape of the historical record. One conference in 1939 that built the object. One regulatory package 1977 that rebuilt his structural guarantees, and nothing else in between of comparable scope. What ended Specfcully on April 1st, 1977, was not a single vehicle, a single route, or a single driver's career. What ended was an entire mode of governing school bus construction, one in which safety was substantially a matter of individual bodybuilder reputation, individual state requirements that varied widely in rigor, and individual district judgment about what a good bus looked like. What began was a system in which the federal government specified, in enforceable numerical terms, what every large school bus sold in the country had to survive before a single child sat down in it. Every school bus safety standard written since the 1992 emergency exit upgrades, the later flammability and mirror requirements, the wheelchair securement standards that gradually caught up to the promise of accessible transportation, was built as an addition to this 1977 structure, not a replacement for it. The 1977 package was the foundation everything after it stood on. This did not feel, to anyone living through it, like a historical hinge. It felt like a delivery invoice, a compliance plate, a slightly heavier ride, a school board budget line that was a little larger than the year before. That is, in fact, the accurate texture of how large regulatory changes actually arrive inside ordinary institutions, not as an announced transformation, but as a stack of specific, unglamorous requirements that a specific person in a specific garage has to check against a specific vehicle, one morning at a time, for years. What then does it mean that the system a child rode through in 1978, the vehicle beneath them rebuilt from the frame up, the ride around them almost entirely unchanged, was already quietly a fundamentally different system than the one their older sibling had ridden 5 years before? Because the rule governed manufacture, its limits were built into it from the start. And those limits are the honest ending of this story, rather than a complication to smooth over. Older buses did not become new buses. A district's decision to keep a 1971 bus running through 1983 was not a violation of anything. It was simply outside what the 1977 standard could reach, because the standard had never claimed jurisdiction over vehicles already built. The specific knowledge that mattered most on any given morning: which family needed an extra minute at the stop, which street of road turned to mud in March, which child was always last, remained exactly where it had always lived, in the driver, built through years of the same route, and in the children, built through years of the same order. No federal standard touched that knowledge, protected T, or replaced T. It was never the standard's job to. What the standard did do and did permanently, was change what safe was allowed to mean for a school bus sold in the United States from that date forward. Before April 1st, 1977, a bus's fuel tank, body joints, and seating survived a crash the way its specific manufacturer had chosen to build it, with no federal number behind that choice. After that date, it survived a crash, or was legally not permitted to be sold as new. That is not a small change dressed up as a large one. It is a large change that happened to feel small, because it lived entirely in the structure of the vehicle and never once in the daily experience of reading it. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these routes, these vehicles, and the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There is more regulatory history, more route history, and more of the specific knowledge that daily repetition built, and that no record ever fully captured. Nobody or dang a school bus today thinks about the reinforced roof over their head or the shelved tank under their seat. Both X'd because of a regulatory date almost no one who benefits from it has ever heard of. And if you have a memory of a bus, a driver, a specific year your district's fleet changed, a specific difference you noticed and never had explained to you, put it in the comments. If you rode a bus built before or after April 1977, do you remember anyone ever explaining why the newer buses looked or rode differently? Or did nobody explain it at all? A future video follows one specific rural district's decade-long fight to retire its last pre-1977 bus under exactly this kind of budget pressure. A transportation supervisor in a rural garage in the spring of 1977 ran his hand along a steel fuel tank shield that had not existed on the district's buses the year before. He could not have told you that morning that he was standing at the formal end of an era that had run, essentially unbroken, since 1939. He knew only what the invoice told him and what the federal specification sheet required him to check against it. That was enough. The rest of the system, the routes, the drivers, the children who knew a road the way they knew their own house in the dark, went on exactly as it had the day before, carried now, without any of them noticing it, inside a structure built to survive what the one before it had not been required to.